Recording.
Hello and welcome. I call to order this February 17th, 2021 meeting of the Needham Finance Committee. As a preliminary matter, permit me to confirm that all members and persons anticipated on the meeting are present and can hear me. Members, when I call your name, please respond in the affirmative. Josh Levy?
Here.
Barry Kaufman?
Here.
John Conley?
Here.
Rick Lunetta?
Here.
Louise Miller?
Here.
Dick Riley?
Here.
Jim Healy?
Here.
And staff member Louise Misgard.
Here.
I'm here too.
Tom, I'm sorry. I don't know how I missed your name. Good evening. This open meeting of the Needham Finance Committee is being conducted remotely, consistent with Governor Baker's executive order of March 12th, 2020, due to the current state of emergency in the Commonwealth due to the outbreak of the COVID-19 virus. As an aside, I'd like to point out that in 2 meetings from now, we will have anniversaried that momentous event. In order to mitigate the transmission of the COVID-19 virus, we have been advised and directed by the Commonwealth to suspend public gatherings. And as such, the governor's order suspends the requirement of the open meeting law to have all meetings in a publicly accessible physical location. Further, all members of public bodies are allowed and encouraged to participate remotely. This order allows public bodies to meet entirely remotely, so long as reasonable public access is afforded and the public can follow along with the deliberations of the meeting. Ensuring public access does not ensure public participation unless such participation is required by law. Except for the agenda item entitled Citizen Request to Address the Finance Committee, this meeting will not feature public comment. For this meeting, the Needham Finance Committee is convening by a Zoom app as posted on the town's website, identifying how the public may join. Please note that the meeting is being recorded and that some attendees are participating by video conference. All supporting materials that have been provided members of this body will be available on the town's website unless otherwise noted. The public is encouraged to follow along using the posted agenda unless the chair notes otherwise. As a first order of business, I would ask for a motion that this meeting will be continued to the committee's next meeting of March 3rd, 2021, if a technical problem develops. Is there such a motion?
So moved. Second.
Let's just vote on that. Thank you. Rick?
Yes.
Barry?
Yes.
Louise?
Yes.
Tom?
Yes.
John?
Yes.
Dick?
Yes.
Josh?
Yes.
Jim?
Yes.
And myself. Thank you. We are now turning to the first item on the agenda. Before we do so, I just want to remind everybody that I will introduce each speaker on the agenda after they conclude their remarks. The chair will go down the line of members, inviting each by name to provide any comment, questions, or motions. Please hold until your name is called. Thank you. First item on this agenda for this evening, citizens' request to address the Finance Committee.
Madam Chair, I see no hands raised.
Okay, thank you. The next item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes of February 10th, 2021. Did everybody have a chance to review the minutes? Dick?
Madam Chair, I move their approval.
Thank you. Do I have a second?
Second.
Great. Roll call vote. Rick?
Yes.
Barry?
Yes.
Tom?
Yes.
John?
Yes.
Dick?
Yes.
Josh?
Yes.
Louise? We're approving the minutes.
Yes.
Jim?
Yes.
And myself, yes. Thank you. Minutes are approved. So what we're going to do first is we're going to turn to the warrant articles first, just because of some time constraints on participants, and then we'll save our budget discussions for later on in the meeting. So the first warrant article is small repair grant program. And to do that, is Lee Newman discussing that?
Yes, Madam Chair, I will bring Lee Newman into the meeting.
Great. And I believe that is on page 7 of the warrant, although this draft warrant does not include page numbers.
Madam Chair, if I may, there's a pretty good discussion in the town manager's budget at 3-112.
Yeah. Hi, Lee, how are you?
Fine, how are you? I also have Karen Sonneborg, the housing specialist with me, and Jean McKnight from the chair of the Needham Planning Board.
Great.
Do you want them to come in?
Yes, please.
Good evening.
Good evening. Jean and Karen, thank you for coming to our meeting. Appreciate that. We're turning firstly to the small repair grant program.
Yes, so this is a request to continue a program that was originally funded back in 2019. There was an appropriation of approximately $50,000 to provide municipal assistance to financially eligible senior and disabled households for health and safety repairs to their existing owner-occupied homes. And if you'd like a brief overview of the program accomplishments to date, Karen Sonneborg could give you a brief overview of that.
That would be great.
So with the $50,000 allocation, we did 2 funding rounds, one in the summer of, or in the fall of 2019, and we had 4 participants from that round. And then we did another one last summer. We got another 9 participants. Those 2 rounds have basically encumbered the $50,000, and to date we have invoices for about half that amount, a little over $24,000. One of the program's requirements is that you have to be a senior over the age of 60 or have be a person with a disability. All of the participants are well over 60, and 4 of them, well, let's see, about half of them have also have a disability or have a household member with a disability. Most of the work has been for exterior repairs, which is not a surprise given COVID-19. People have been concerned about having contractors in their homes. And so work has been focused largely on railing, step, walkway repairs, door, window repairs, that type of thing. We expect, that that when spring arrives, we'll have another kind of spurt of activity and hopefully be able to expend the remaining funds.
So essentially, this is a request to continue the program, which has been successful with a funding, allocation comparable to what was allocated back in 2019.
Dick?
Just a few questions. Do you give 100% of the requested award? And if not, how do you determine what percent to give? And a follow-up question, do you inspect to see whether the work was in fact done or not?
Good questions. So we provide in the first $50,000, we provide up to $4,000 in grant money. In the next funding rounds, we're planning to go up to $5,000. Most of the applicants, almost all the applicants, have work estimates of more than $4,000, and we do not do inspections, but we ask for photos of the work area, the work to be done before the work is completed, and we ask for photos of the work after it's been completed, and the owner must sign off that the work was done according to their satisfaction.
Louise?
I have two questions. One is, are these all owner-occupied homes? This is my first question. Yes?
Yes.
Must be owner-occupied.
Yes.
Okay. And my second question is, would the town be able to lien the cost of the work? I just curious where we're spending public monies for private homeowners, whether that is a possibility.
They signed a grant agreement that basically, states the terms and conditions of receiving the grant. If there are any violations, they sign it, we will be able to actually ask for the money back. This is a small grant program. It's up to $4,000. The idea was to make it as easy for people to apply and as easy to administer. So we did do some debating about liens and affidavits, and we decided, based on other programs that are also operating throughout the state and in the area, that this was the easiest and the most common way of administrating the program.
And what's 80% of area median income?
Well, it's adjusted annually and it's adjusted by household size. Example would be for a household of 2, the maximum income would be $77,000. For a household of 1, it's $67,400, I believe.
I don't think it would be, I don't think a mechanic's lien would be able to be perfected on the property, Louise, at least in my view.
It's not, I'm thinking of the town liening the property.
Well, I don't think they could do it through just the repair. I don't believe they could.
Right.
I was just wondering, how many applicants you have versus grants made? Do you have
We have 13 applicants that committed all of the money for the allocation, and we have so far received invoices for about half that amount. We expect that there'll be more coming in the spring when it's easier to do the work.
So the first the 50,000 from last year is fully committed?
Yeah, I expect that there's one participant who still says that he wants to participate, but I'm not certain that's going to happen. And there's another one who thought that they were going to use the full $4,000 and is unlikely to. So all in all, I expect that we'll, if we don't commit all of the money, that we might at least commit $45,000.
Barry?
Just remind me, how many years has this program been going on now?
It's just started last year. The first funding round was in November of 2019, and then we had another one this last summer.
Okay, thank you.
Josh?
And are people who've already received a grant eligible to apply again?
If after another full year after getting payment, and there's still some, significant health and safety needs, and they remain eligible, the program will offer them another $3,000.
Rick? Oh, sorry.
If a prospective recipient has met the age threshold and or the disability threshold, is there any other reason why you would say no?
Well, there is another little caveat, which is that we apply like, God, this is like trying to, a very small percentage of their assets, or the difference between the assessed value and the outstanding mortgage, we apply like 2% and add that to their income. So they might be over income if they have, based on the amount of equity that they have in their property.
Well, I guess that
Other than that,
right? Yeah. I guess that would throw away the ease to administer, based on that last criteria you just mentioned.
Yeah, well, we looked closely at what other programs we're operating, and we kind of try to make it a program pretty user-friendly.
I realize your program has just started. Has anyone been refused?
Yeah, there have been some people who've been over income.
Thank you.
Louise?
Was this considered to be administered by any department other than planning and community development?
No, nothing I'm aware of.
Well, I mean, I think that in other communities, and potentially like the senior center could be a good place to administer the program. It just turns out I have a considerable background in program design and affordable housing, and I'm very I had been plugged into other programs, and it seemed like it was something that I could easily take, oversee.
John?
I'd like to make a motion, if I may, that the Finance Committee recommend adoption of the article to appropriate for the small repair grant program.
Second.
Second it.
All right, voice vote, please. Rick?
Yes.
Barry?
Yes.
Louise?
Yes.
Tom?
Yes.
Dick?
Yes.
Josh?
Yes.
Jim?
Yes.
And myself. Great. Thank you. Moving now to planning consulting assistance.
Thank you.
Yes, this is a request for monies to be put aside in the dollar amount of $60,000 to provide planning consulting assistance to the planning board to enable them to hire outside consultants in large part to assist in planning efforts, to conduct planning studies, to do feasibility analysis, build-out analysis, traffic studies. I think the planning board is interested in a couple of zoning districts once we finish the Muzzy property.
Glass, magnifying glass, I meant to bring it.
Once we finish our work on the Muzzy property. So this monies for this kind of a program have been awarded twice in the past. It was awarded back in 2015 with an allocation of $40,000. And it was recently awarded again at the annual town meeting this past May with an allocation of $60,000. And so far we have committed all of the funds under those allocations. The monies have in large part been used on the Muzzy property, and they've involved 2 traffic studies, 2 fiscal impact studies, and 2 urban design looks at that property. So when that work is completed with the rezoning that's anticipated to go forward in the spring, the funds in that allocation will be exhausted. So this is an effort, actually a request to refund that account to enable the planning board to have the monies available to conduct planning studies in the future.
So, oh, go ahead, Louise.
No, my question was going to be, so if projects are actually submit an application for either site plan review or variances, don't they provide funding for those types of
Yes, if there's a peer review that's required on something, then that's different than, we'll say, a planning study just looking at a district in Needham, is looking at what the policy goals are for that district, is assessing its build out and looking at the ramifications of enabling that redevelopment to occur. We do collect monies for peer reviews on projects when it's deemed appropriate. And we recently did that on the children's project when we hired a peer consultant to do a traffic analysis for us.
Thank you.
Josh?
So in June at the annual town meeting, when we appropriated the 60,000, I guess we were told that was going to last about 3 years. So I'm curious what happened since then in the planning and decision making so that it was all spent in less than 1 year.
What happened there was an effort, a desire to move forward on the study that had been done on Muzzy and Channel 5 on that property. And I think it was felt that we needed to do an updated traffic study to collect more current data. And so GPI was basically engaged for that purpose. It was also felt that based upon the input that we received, I think in 2019 on the work that the rezoning proposal for that property, that a number of concerns had been raised about density, about height, about build out. And so it was felt it was necessary to kind of relook at the urban design plan on that property. And so the monies essentially have been allocated to hire consultants in those two areas to provide an updated traffic study, looking at an altered build out, as well as to look at revised urban design plans under an as of right and a special permit scenario.
And do you know how long these $60,000 will be expected to last?
I would think it would last 2 years. I think that's a reasonable timeline.
And is there anything specific that it would be earmarked towards, any types of studies?
Jean, do you want to speak to that, or what our areas of interest are?
Well, during the past several years, we've particularly studied Chestnut Street and very much focused on the Muzzy site in the funds that were appropriated, of course, as Lee said, were spent on the Muzzy site for the most part. We're talking about in the next year or so, considering our zoning when it comes to multifamily housing, looking at every zone where multifamily housing is allowed, considering whether there are other zones where multifamily housing perhaps should be allowed, what the standards would be, and that's a study I'm aware of. And it may be something I'm forgetting that we're also intending to undertake.
Thank you.
Barry, did you have a question or?
No, actually, that was my question.
Okay.
Josh asked it.
Louise?
So this seems to be different from when we originally approved funding back in 2015. So when we originally approved funding back in 2015, it was so that the planning board and the planning department would have sufficient funds available to deal with issues that were coming before them that were not planned issues. So, something like a developer coming in and proposing a particular type of development that would require some type of zoning change, that would give the planning board a fund to access. I think that that's very different from the planning board planning to review certain areas of town for zoning. And those, I think, need to be put into the budget they need to be set as goals of the department. And in my view, that isn't what originally this article was meant for. The other thing is I am a little troubled by the quickness with which the funding was expended. This is an allocation that the first allocation took years to spend, and that was the 2015 allocation. And now it seems like this is a source of funding for projects that properly should have either their own financial warrant article at town meeting, or they're part of the planning and community development's goals on an annual basis. So I'm just a little troubled by the planning for, and I use planning in a non-pun way, but I'm a little troubled by the change in the way in which the funding is planned to be used.
The funding has historically been used as I've described it. Back when we received the $45,000 initially, the money was used to do basically the preliminary work, which was a look at the Industrial 1 district, which involved the entire district, of which Muzzy was carved out as a component. So it has been used to look at districts, to look at redevelopment potential since its inception. So in terms of its actual utilization, the pattern hasn't changed.
If I may add, in response to that question, when it comes to particular projects that are brought forth, for example, a project that might require a special permit, and we want to have peer review of, say, in stormwater drainage or traffic impact, we have the developers pay for that. So it's our forward-looking planning where we're thinking about a particular area that we want to study. And particularly in the case of the Muzzy property, it was helpful to have design, both traffic design, financial impact professionals preparing reports and preparing visuals for us. And that is likely to come up again when we're thinking ahead of zoning areas for the benefit of the town.
Jim?
So my own view is that I think that first off, the reviews that are done by the applicants or by the proposers, that's all a bag job, with all due respect. They're hiring people that are going to give them an opinion. We've hired expert witnesses in our lifetime, and they get paid for a reason. And the reason is they get paid to give the opinion that they want. So I'm not interested in that. And I happen to agree with Louise that if you're going to do this, it should be part of the budget. In other words, we're going to say, we are going to do this study. We are going to do this, and we need some money to help pay for the analysis of whether it's appropriate or not. That, I think, is fine. But to have it to be without any type of discernible request and discernible goal, I don't think that's appropriate. I think there's time and money that can be allocated when it's properly requested.
John, did you have a comment? You had your
hand. It was along the lines of that. I mean, I think that, and I think, what sort of justifies what Jim and Louise were saying was just what happened with this $60,000. It gets appropriated for July 1st, and here we are in February, and it's all gone. When we were told something different about how long it was going to last. And so I don't have a level of confidence. I have a level of confidence if there's a specific project that we're being asked to appropriate money for, to hear the reason why, and then to discuss whether to do so or not. But to just sort of put it out there to say, well, we think we might be doing this, or we think we might be doing that, almost invites that thinking to take place, rather than to have that thinking take place ahead of time and say, this is what we want to do, and this is why we need the money to do it.
Well, I'd like to further ask Lee to respond, because I feel as though my response was inadequate in describing the kind of planning studies we may have ahead of us. And our planning director may know better what she has in mind for this work.
So why don't those be presented and say, this is what we want to do and this is the money we want for it, as opposed to sort of this general fund? That's the part that I'm wrestling with.
Well, I think what we were interested in doing, one of the projects that's a high priority, is looking at the Chestnut Street corridor, because we rezoned that area back in 2009, and we haven't seen the redevelopment potential that we had anticipated or had hoped for. So one of the goals of the board was to take a relook at that zoning plan and profile, to determine what kinds of modifications might be required or necessary to be able to allow that development to happen. The other area we were interested in looking at was the block really where Sudbury Farms is located. That's a district, it's a business district, whose use profile is really not in keeping with the policy goals and objectives that the town really has for that district. It was the one piece that got left out at the time the zoning for Avery Square was done. Behind that district on Hillside is an industrial district also, which hasn't been updated with use profiles and dimensional requirements, which are really not, I don't think, in keeping with what the town's goals or actual vision is for those areas. So those are three areas I think the board was looking at focusing on, and might need some technical assistance, I think, in moving that forward.
Go ahead, Jim.
I think that's everybody's point.
Right.
You just made everybody's point. So if there's a particular project and you've now identified three areas that you guys may want to do more on, that's fine. So that should be part of your budget request. And then the finance committee can make an informed judgment whether that's something they want to fund or not. The point is, and I know I harp on words, town's goals, objectives, and visions. Well, those aren't my goals, objectives, and visions, and it may not be the finance committee's goals, objectives, and visions. So I think that if you're going to spend the town's money, the taxpayers' money, you should come to us and say, here's what we want to do. Here's what we want to spend this money on. And then we can say to you, we agree, we don't agree.
Dick.
Yeah, I'm sympathetic to the thrust of what's just been said, but I think perhaps a financial warrant article rather than the budget makes more sense, because this may not be spent within the fiscal year. I think as long as it's geared to specifically identified projects, we're protected against the issue that we were worried about, but putting in a financial warrant article gives them some flexibility over the period of time in which it can be spent.
Yeah.
If there are specific projects identified.
Precisely.
Yes, and Lee mentioned Chestnut Street, and many of you may remember, I think it was 15 years ago, before my term on the planning board started, when I served on the downtown, Needham Center downtown Chestnut Street Study Committee, when we come up with a new zoning concept for that entire area. And in these 15 years, we have had one project that's taken advantage of that zoning that we worked so hard on. And we really need to take another look at the zoning for our business areas. In recent years, we've concentrated on Needham Crossing and the areas on the other side of 128. And we really need to concentrate on what we think of as our spine. Highland Avenue, Chestnut Street. What should our zoning be to encourage the kind of development we want in that area? And when I focus my original comment on housing, it goes way beyond housing. It really is what kind of mixed-use development is best for that area.
Gary?
I don't think anybody's questioning, I guess, the why this you need or you desire to do this. I think a lot of it has. I do believe, as Dick just said, this should be in the warrant article because it's not a recurring expense, and I wouldn't want to think of it as such. But I think the lack of specificity in the way the article is currently written is why these questions are being raised. I'm not saying these are unworthy studies to be done, and maybe that's the solution, I guess, is coming back with a much more specific warrant article.
I do have one, I have one question that's somewhat different than the line of questioning that we're going down, but because the economic development officer or position was transferred out of your group to the budget of the town manager, do they have any impact on the types of planning funds that you would be spending? Does that change?
No, I don't think so. I think the goals are similar in terms of wanting to encourage redevelopment in Needham's business districts and looking at what might be getting in the way of that and what kinds of dimensional or land use or what kind of dimensional or land use changes are appropriate. I think there's a synergy between those two groups working toward those common goals.
Rick.
Gene, I don't know how to ask this correctly, I don't think, but the Chestnut Street review that would go towards the warrant article, if the warrant article wasn't there in terms of the day-to-day business of the planning board, would you be about doing that? Or would that not get done?
I would say that it would not get done on the level that the town expects. I mean, what we've been using consultants to do is to assist us in doing a build-out analysis, is to assist us with urban design planning, is to assist us with traffic planning or fiscal impact analysis at a pretty high level, which I think is what the expectation is in Needham. So a lot of the work can be done, in-house, internally. But when you're really looking at a major rezoning, like on the Muzzy site, or you're looking at significant districts and you're looking at comprehensive planning for the redevelopment of those areas, it really requires bringing in folks with disciplines in these different areas and with a high level of expertise. And I think that's the standard that Needham expects. I think they expect that quality of work, and I think they expect that sophisticated type of analysis.
Then a follow-up question, if I may, Lee. And I can understand your wanting to do service delivery par excellence. If you were to throw all those resources in an operating budget, could it get done in a year? If you took all the stuff you wanted to do at the service delivery level that you just spoke of, and you put it all in your operating budget, could it get done in a year?
I guess I really don't quite understand what is the question you're trying to get me to answer. I want to be responsive.
Well, I'm not trying to lead you anywhere. I'm just trying to play with what Dick said. If what you want to do is going to go beyond the scope of a fiscal year, then in terms of my mind, it makes sense also to put it in a warrant that allows you to spend the money over a fiscal year.
Yes,
but if you took all the resources that you needed to accomplish this task, could you get it done in a year?
No, I don't think so. I think this kind of work really takes a longer period of time than just one budget year. And I think that was the reason why the monies were put into a warrant article, to create that kind of flexibility so that it could be spent over multiple years without those constraints.
Okay, thank you.
Tom.
I'm curious, was this originally put in with the mindset that you were going to do the projects you mentioned, or was it to be established so that you could move quickly in case of there was a need for a study? I'm thinking back when Muzzy first started, you didn't have any funds, and there was a lot of call for funds. So I'm a little confused if was this the original idea is that the planning board would have a bucket of money available so they can move quickly? Or is this identified for certain projects? If it's identified for certain projects, you should put that in the warrant article itself with the expectation that you're going to spend X amount of money on the Chestnut Seed project and the other ones that you mentioned. If it's identified that you want to move quickly, then it's sort of a different conversation. So I'm trying to figure out what I'm being asked to approve here.
I think the idea when it was done back in, I think, 2015 when we did it, was to give the planning board access to money to deal with problems that were evolving and that were not necessarily, not where there was necessarily a concrete study that you wanted to focus on, so that as issues arose, you had the monies available to bring in expertise and in different disciplines to assist the planning board in its decision making. And there have been changes, I think, in Needham that require a quick response that weren't necessarily, anticipated.
In my mind, that's a slightly different conversation than the one that we're talking about right now. So I'm not sure which conversation we're having. Are we giving the planning board access to money so they can move quickly? And that's one debate that we might want to discuss. Or are we identifying certain projects that add up to $60,000 that you need to spend over the next 2 or 3 years?
I think we're looking at monies that will give the planning board funds to allow them to respond to planning issues that evolve over time. And I'm trying to communicate to you that there are some of these planning issues out there that have evolved that we can kind of see looking forward. So we're not kind of totally blind here. We have no idea where monies might be necessary, but how they're weighted, or which ones are dealt with first and which ones become more important to move forward on quickly is not necessarily clear. So we're not doing a study like we did the downtown study where there was a clear idea. We wanted to do an urban design plan for Needham Center. It didn't.
Hello.
So, so I don't think there's a vision of doing, a study like we did for the New England Business Center, or a study like we did for Needham Center that was clearly defined and there was a scope of work that was created. I think these are more parts of problems that need to be addressed and that are evolving over time. And some of them become more important to deal with than others.
Sorry, Carol, you're not here, so I'm just going to chime in. I couldn't disagree more. The point of the matter is zoning is the slowest thing in town. Zoning doesn't happen overnight. I remember when the Conservation Commission, they wanted to have a pool of money to be able to respond to people that were going to sell sites that we wanted to keep as conservation. I got that. That was important. You need to be able to move quickly. Zoning doesn't move quickly. And so I don't agree with that. And I really get back to what I said earlier. If there are certain priorities and certain things that you want to embark upon, that's fine. Bring it before the Finance Committee and we'll decide whether we think it's worth funding. But I don't like the notion of giving a pool of money and then letting the planning board and the planning director decide whether this initiative, as I said, the goals, objectives, and visions, which no one else has chimed in on, whether or not that's appropriate or reasonable for the town to consider.
Dick.
Follow-up question on what Jim was just talking about. If this is not in the context of the budget cycle in town meeting, is there a mechanism for the planning board to come to the Finance Committee and ask for money? I don't think there is. And basically, this is in lieu thereof.
Isn't that called the reserve fund?
Well, I'm not sure that that's consistent with the reserve fund. The thought occurred to me, but that seems to me to be for exceptional and unanticipated needs rather than, this seems more on the regular course of events, but can't be identified and quantified in advance.
But it sounds to me like some of it, Lee, correct me if I'm wrong, you have a sense for where you want to spend the money. So it is a question of quantifying what you might need to spend and over what time frame you intend to spend that. So is that, or is that not the case?
Well, I don't think that we're talking about doing a specific study like we did for the like we did for the downtown or we did for the New England Business Center. I mean, this would be monies to do a fiscal impact study on something that we felt was appropriate. It might be to do a build out component of on a district in town, which is not really a comprehensive review, but it's a component of what needs to be done to advance a planning initiative.
And in the case of Muzzy, the Muzzy proposal, one of the things that was important to the planning board was to get community input and to present the zoning ideas to the community. And in order to do that, we needed good visuals to present. And, you know, we hired an architect to prepare those visuals so that people would understand what we were proposing. And if you know, if a similar situation comes up in the next year or two where we want to bring something before town meeting that we feel would benefit from that kind of visual presentation, we would want to be prepared to do the same again. You know, if a developer is putting forth, if it's really a developer wanting to see a particular development on a site, of course, they will engage an architect and work with us to try to put an article before town meeting. But very often, we're looking at a site and wanting, with our own vision of what we think would be best, that we want to bring to town meeting, and we want to do a good job on that.
Rick?
That seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, but that seems to be something that would be in the normal course of business of the planning board in terms of your planning and execution of where you think planning should be. And anything above and beyond, I like the idea of coming to the reserve fund for those unexpected things. But what you'd explain to me, what you just said, seems to me as you're thinking about how you run your business every day, those are the kinds of things that engage conversation every day. And those are the kinds of things that you do that have expenses attached to them that you would add to your operating budget. Am I misunderstanding you?
Well, I think we felt that this was some of these needs were not necessarily known were not necessarily known ahead. And I think there was a desire to have access to money over multiple years and not be restricted to a fiscal year. And that this was a vehicle that created that flexibility. I think that's why it was created back in 2015.
Louise.
So having been there back in 2015, the planning department came with a request for an increase to the operating budget. And at the time, the finance committee did not want a permanent increase to the planning department budget. And we did not feel, if I recall correctly, that the type of expense that the planning department was requesting was something that would be sustained on an annual basis. So instead, we opted for a financial warrant article to see what would happen. What types of expenses does the planning department have, and over what period of time would these funds be expended? And the $45,000 lasted from, I think it was an appropriation in May 2014. It could have been May 2015.
It was 2015.
Then it was May 2015 all the way through 2020.
That's correct.
It lasted a full 5 years. And then last year, you know, we had the same article, and I think all of us thought, well, you know, this worked pretty well. We had $45,000 over 5 years, and we voted in favor of funding $60,000 over the next whatever number of years. But it now seems that the direction of the planning department and the planning board have changed with respect to that funding allocation.
I would say that the Muzzy site presented a unique situation where the money was in the 60,000. There was a desire and a goal to unlock the redevelopment potential on that property. And there was a goal coming from the select board and the planning board to look at moving forward there. And it required the development of an urban design plan. It required an updated traffic study. It required a fiscal impact study. It required a relook at the zoning, and the monies were in that account to enable that. So I don't anticipate that there's going to be a project comparable to that, which is going to eat up $60,000 on a major study. I think that was a unique situation that we all found ourselves in, with a goal of trying to move forward on a project. And I think, and do it in a way that was responsive to what, you know, the community wanted and what the different boards had articulated were their needs and goals.
Josh?
So I guess I still don't understand what happened last year, because with Muzzy, I think it was already known by last town meeting that it was the goals of the planning board and the select board to continue to look at Muzzy. I didn't know, I guess, that those $60,000 were going to be spent on Muzzy, and I think town meeting members probably would have appreciated knowing that before they voted on it. So I guess if there is a specific, like Barry said, if there's something specific or a set of specific things that the money is going to be spent on, then I think it should be enumerated in the warrant article. On the other hand, if this is a routine type of thing where every year there will be a set of items that the planning board wants to look at, then it probably should be in the budget. And then I think the concern about spending over fiscal years probably won't be a problem, because it'll probably be recurring every year in the budget.
Dick?
Yeah, I think Josh has made some excellent points. Personally, I'm troubled by the tenor of some of the earlier remarks that suggested that it's the purview of the finance committee to decide whether a specific project is worthy of funding or not. I don't think that's our role. I think the question before the finance committee is it reasonable to provide the planning department with the ability to get outside expertise on given matters, much like the legal department goes and hires specialists for given items. So I think it is reasonable. Then it comes down to the question of, is that best done through a financial warrant article or the budget? And I think the points that Josh just made were persuasive. So let's put it in the budget, a given number, and go ahead. But I think it's our job is to decide whether it's reasonable to give the planning department the ability to hire expertise as needed. And I think the answer to that is clearly yes.
Jim?
So Mr. Riley, I love you dearly, but we're never going to agree on any of this. I think that we have an obligation, absolute obligation, on behalf of the taxpayers of this town to comment on any request for funding. We have that obligation. You don't seem to think so, which is fine. I respect you and I love you, and we'll never agree on it. But I think we do have that obligation. And in this particular case, if a department wants to put forward a request, whether it's in the budget or in the financial warrant article, that suggests that monies be spent towards a given endeavor, we should make that decision whether that is in the best interest of the taxpayers of Needham. And if they want to spend money for consultants or experts on a particular project, and we don't believe that that project is in the best interest of the town of Needham, we shouldn't be spending money for that endeavor. So I get it. I understand you. I respect you, but I don't agree with you. That being said, I agree with the second half of your argument. And I do agree that to the extent that we want to allocate money to a particular project, it should be identified and it should be put in some sort of whether it's within the budget or whether it's in the financial warrant article, we should look at it and then make that decision accordingly. I would also say a lot of people have been saying, let's put it all in financial warrant articles. Let's do this. Well, you know, to some extent, it passes on the question of whether or not something that's in a budget lives there forever. We may think it does, and maybe it's hard to get it out, which I agree with. You've said it before, but it's not impossible to get out. And in fact, in my little tutorial that I took with the master, Dave Davison, he said that the departments are asked whether or not from one year to the next, there is an item that is no longer subject to a potential funding, and they're supposed to identify that. And to some extent, I think that can be used here. So as they say, I agree in part and I disagree in part.
So where does that leave us? Do we want to get a more specific description of what should be in this warrant article, or?
I think maybe a better description of what you intend to spend it on and amount and timing would be helpful. And to the extent that some of that, you know, and then we can have a discussion as to whether X amount of funds should be included in the budget or it should be reserved for a warrant article.
Okay, so you're looking for me to put together a more detailed profile of what the monies would be used for. Yes, and then and Lee, if you could, timing of those funds. Okay. Thank you. Does anybody have anything else on this matter for Lee? All right. Lee, Jean, thank you.
All right, thank you. And we will confer further, of course, and be back before you. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much. So is Karis there, Dave? Karis Lustig.
Yes, Madam Chair, she is here.
Okay, so I know we have property tax assistance, but let's skip over and start with the public facilities maintenance program. Anything that Karis is here to speak on, and then we can come back to that.
Okay, I will promote Karis to a panelist, and if there's anybody else, she'll let us know.
Thank you. Can you bring Cecilia Simchek in as well? And then I think depending on the questions, we may bring in other subject matter experts as necessary.
Great. So Karis, thank you for coming. And so what we are talking about first is the public facilities maintenance program to appropriate the sum of $1 million to fund that. So
this is a program that's been in place, I would say, at least 10 years at this point. And it's an article that's used specifically to fund projects that don't typically fall into the category of capital, or they are so routine that we would be putting the same request in every year, or to help fund some extraordinary repairs that aren't necessarily anticipated in our capital program. You'll see that there's a fairly significant increase in our request from fiscal 21 to fiscal 22. And that's largely prompted by the school master plan study that was completed at the end of this fall. And largely building maintenance and the design and construction division have been working on outlining a plan based on that school master plan for the repairs that need to be made to our facilities. That's a fairly elaborate process, and we did not have the time to fully complete that process prior to the submission of our fiscal 22 budget. But we did want to make sure that there were sufficient funds for us to identify critical needs that could be repaired, you know, in the 1 year interim between us cataloging all of those additional repairs and putting a formal capital request together and in this particular budget submission. So that's one of the reasons for the increase in our submission this year. The other reason is that all of the warrant article funds that we have appropriated from fiscal 21 were utilized for preparing the schools to reopen in the spring. So, in the fall. So there are projects that were originally slated to be completed last summer that were not completed that we anticipate on completing this summer. The two buildings that we're focusing on primarily for this article are the Mitchell and the Pollard School. Both buildings are in the school department's capital requests for the future. So improvements that need to be made to that school in order to be impactful need to be made sooner. And there are certain items in those studies that were identified as critical need that should be done this summer before schools reopen in the fall.
Great. Questions? Louise?
One question, are we anticipating that we're going to get CARES Act reimbursement for any of those projects that we did this year in anticipation of reopening schools? And my second question then is what the source of funding will be for this particular article.
I'm going to defer to Dave to answer at least the second part of that question. And I know the first part of the question is yes, but I don't know to what extent we'll be fully reimbursed for those items.
Dave?
Madam Chair, the funding source for this article would be free cash.
Barry?
So I assume before this goes before town meeting, there's going to be, as usual, an itemized specific list of specific projects. So, can you, even on a rough basis, compare what this number to last year, and then, maybe when you think we could get an itemized list of what the $1 million is going to be spent on specifically?
So I know, like I said, building maintenance division and the building design and construction division have been meeting weekly to go through the school master plan. I believe they already have a list of items. They're just finalizing the cost of those items. So we should have that information shortly. And I think for comparison, I can't remember off the top of my head. Cecilia, do you recall what last year's appropriation was?
I believe around 650,000.
Dick?
You're muted, Dick.
Mute, Dick.
A question of Dave, a follow-up question about the grants. If we get a grant, as Louise asked the question, I assume that has to be spent on the specific purpose. So that if we get a grant, I'll make a number up, $300,000 comes in, so that $300,000 would then have to be spent on these specific activities. Am I correct?
The monies that we've applied for reimbursement are related to costs associated directly with COVID-19, particularly in the area of air handling, disinfectant, cleaning. And those monies, as they're expended, we are filing for reimbursements. The federal government's recently changed some of the grant programs, and they are now stating that items that for cleaning and responding to HVAC expenses, which may have been eligible for a 75% reimbursement, are now 100%. So those expenses under the CARES program, the CARES requires you to apply for funds at all other available resources, and CARES is supposed to be the funding source of last resort. So what will happen now is the 25% that we were anticipating from CARES is now going to be coming from the federal government directly from FEMA. When those monies, if they're received many of these expenses were expended from the operating budget. And if they're received in this fiscal year, they basically will replenish the budget for those monies that were spent for COVID to be spent for the original intended purposes. If they come in after the close of the fiscal year, the FEMA grant would close out to free cash for the following year.
So see if I understand it. If it's a reimbursement program, so we have to raise the money and spend it, then apply to be reimbursed. If that reimbursement comes within the fiscal year, we can apply it back in the budget. If it's the next year, it springs over to free cash?
Correct. It's we spend it first and get reimbursed second.
Okay, Rick?
This is kind of maybe a follow-up question to Barry. In terms of the projects, did the $1 million get thought of and then projects are working towards it? Or did all the projects accumulate to $1 million? So I guess my question is, how did you arrive at $1 million?
So in preparing our submission, I think I indicated we did not have, we had, I think, received the completed report from the consultants about 3 days before our capital and operating budgets were due. So we did look at a quick overview of the project list, and determined that we thought $1 million would be sufficient to perform our normal routine activities that we have under this article, like floor refinishing and painting, but would also accommodate a portion of the items that are outlined as being critical need in the report. So the dollars were identified first, and now we're doing the action of vetting out individual items. We do believe the list that we have already will likely exceed the $1 million that we submitted, and that's the additional vetting work that the group will be doing over the next few weeks to make sure that we can fit with under the $1 million.
So will you live within the $1 million, or will you want more?
Our intention is to live within the $1 million for the next fiscal year.
Thank you.
Josh.
Karis, could you explain the logic behind putting most of this towards Mitchell and Pollard? So I know there's, I guess, a school master plan where those schools are prioritized for replacement, and I don't think anything's been decided yet on the timing of that. But I guess some people might ask, if these schools are going to be replaced, what are the improvements and how long will they last? And would the town get better return if the money were spent on schools that were going to last longer?
So I think most of the repairs that were identified are about making the building comfortable for the people who are currently occupying them. They're not so much about the long-term longevity of maintaining the building. So it's about sort of physical improvements that we can make so that the students who are in that school and who may never see a renovated school are comfortable in those spaces. They're not so much some of the other repairs that we may have in other schools that are maybe less cosmetic and maybe less urgent in terms of their need, but need to be scheduled within the next several years as part of their predictive maintenance. So the reason of focusing on Mitchell and Pollard is doesn't make sense to repaint all of the corridors. 1 year before you tear the building down, you want to repaint them now so the people who occupy that building can live in a comfortable space.
Thank you.
And Pollard in particular is going to ultimately be a major renovation. I think some of the projects are anticipated to have longevity for the future project that's ultimately going to happen at Pollard.
So any other questions on this? It sounds like we're going to get further clarity on the specific projects. So this is not something that we can really vote on now. Is that? Okay. NIPTE's permit compliance, and that is on page 8 and 9 of the warrant article.
So this item was submitted last year as a DSR-4, and then after discussions with the Finance Committee and the Finance Director, it was transitioned to a financial warrant article. This is work that is required of the town to be in compliance with our NPDES permit. And most of this is annual reporting work that is required to be conducted each year. We have funds from last year that we are in the process of executing contracts on, or have executed contracts on, in order to conduct this work. And we anticipate that we will have those funds expended by the either end of this fiscal year or the beginning of next fiscal year. And we'll then need to repeat some of these programs in the next year as part of our normal NPDES reporting.
Does anybody have questions on this? Louise?
If it's going to be a recurring expense, I think we need to figure out where we're paying for it out of either operating expense or some other fee type program.
Is this work all outsourced?
Yes.
And it's an annual reporting function, to Louise's point.
Yes.
And Louise, how would you do that as a fee-based program?
So I think we talked about some type of a stormwater and maybe an enterprise fund or revolving fund of some sort.
Anybody else want to comment on that? Josh?
And just for clarification, so this is just reporting. There are funds already, maybe they're in the capital budget, I forget, related to NPDES as well, right?
Yeah, so this is the inspection, the reporting, and sort of small adjustments that are made, whereas the capital funding is really for large construction projects that we have associated with water quality improvement projects.
And we might get to that later on. Do you have that number off the top of your head? What's in the capital budget?
Thanks, Cecilia. I know it's
I know for FY22 we're requesting about $660,000.
Okay.
It was a little bit higher this year, but there was some startup stuff that was associated with that doesn't follow up the outgoing years.
Thank you.
Dick?
I'll go back to Louise's question, and I'm reading the text. This funding will be sought on an annual basis to inspect and evaluate the best practices. Why isn't this an annual budget item?
I can add.
Actually, Dick, excuse me, Dave.
Yes, when the funding request came last year, after conversation and hearing what the expenses would be incurred, the Finance Committee had suggested that it shouldn't be in the operating budget at this point, but it should be tried as an annual, as a financial warrant article, and then to see if it needs to be ongoing or not. And certainly with that understanding, and my thought was a 2-year trial with financial warrant articles, then it would be coming in, if it is going to continue being at this dollar level, that it would be part of the annual drains program that's in the operating budget.
And Dave, this is year 2 of this, right?
This would be the second year of funding, yes.
Dick?
That makes sense to me.
Yeah. Louise?
Are the Board of Selectmen looking at establishing some type of a fee-based program for NPDES?
Dave?
Yes, in fact, prior to COVID-19, one of the last meetings before COVID-19, the Select Board was going to hold their public hearing about establishing a fee structure. That is in consideration. And in fact, the concept that was going to be presented to him was one that I actually had a working group, folks from the Water and Sewer Rate Structure Committee of a stabilization fund. The thought was that part of the NIPD's program should continue to be funded from the general fund, and then the extensive capital cost would be funded by a fee structure. And that is on the docket to be discussed with the board this spring.
Louise.
May I make a motion that the Finance Committee recommend approval of Article, whatever number it's going to have, appropriate for NIPD's permit compliance?
Second.
Amount of $195,000.
Second.
Voice vote. Rick?
Yes.
Barry?
Yes.
Myself, yes. Louise, yes.
Yes.
John? John? You lost John.
John's frozen.
He's back.
Dick?
Yes.
Josh?
Yes.
Tom?
Yes.
And Jim? Thank
Yes.
you. Fleet refurbishment. And that is on
Page 9.
page 9. And the capital budget, section 357.
So this is the second time that DPW is putting in a request, at least in recent history, for a fleet refurbishment article. I believe our original request was a little over 4 years ago in order to do some refurbishment on our existing pieces of equipment to extend life cycles. We have come very close to and will very shortly be exhausting the full amount of that original appropriation and are seeking additional follow-up funds. Some of the things that this particular article has enabled us to do has been to convert a piece of equipment that was coming off of Frontline to a dedicated piece of snow equipment. It's been used to refurbish plows, do a significant amount of work on our sidewalk tractors to continue them in operation. So we've utilized it quite frequently to extend the life of our existing pieces of equipment. And so we would like to continue that process and have the funds available to continue making repairs to our existing equipment to extend the life cycles. We did a fleet study several years ago, and part of the recommendations of that fleet study was to bring many of our life cycles out. So we moved a lot of our smaller equipment from 8 to 10 years and many of our larger pieces of equipment from 10 to 12 years. And part of supporting that program is having this refurbishment funds available in order to extend the life. And I know that Dave talked about it when we did our presentation on the whole fleet, but now we are looking at each individual piece of equipment each year. And sometimes we are able to extend the life cycle out based on the type of maintenance that's been conducted on those pieces of equipment.
Thank you. Dick?
Yeah, are these dollars spent on parts, or is it outsourcing labor, or is it both?
Both. So the conversion of the old piece of equipment to a dedicated snow fighter was done in-house using equipment that we purchased, but we did the conversion to that piece. But other projects have been completely outsourced. So it really depends on the scope of work and whether or not we believe it's well suited to something that we would do in-house, or if it's better suited to be outsourced.
But to the extent it's done in-house, you're not using these funds for that. It's just for labor outside or parts outside, correct?
Correct. We have not used it to supplement any of our overtime or any of our regular funds for our staff.
Thank you.
Right. Rick?
Is this an annual reoccurring cost?
I think our initial assumption when we did this was that the $250,000 would last us 3 years, and it ended up lasting us, I think, 4 or 5 years. So it's an item that we anticipate coming back to the Finance Committee for in the future, but not in the immediate future.
Gotcha. How long do you think it'll take to spend down the $195,000 as to now?
I think it'll be 3 to 5 years.
Okay. Thank you.
Dick?
Madam Chair, I move that the Finance Committee recommend adoption of fleet reimbursement article in the warrant, whatever article it is.
I'll second it.
Great. A voice vote. Barry?
Yes.
Louise?
Yes.
John?
Yes.
Myself? Yes. Josh?
Yes.
Tom?
Yes.
Jim?
Yes.
Great. Thank you.
And I'll say yes too.
Oh, sorry. Well, you, and Dick, yes. And then lastly, Rosemary Dam decommissioning. And that is, I guess, on page 9.
I believe Louise circulated a letter that we received from town council regarding the opinion that we sought on Rosemary Dam and how to pursue the decommissioning of that dam. And we got very similar guidance from Christopher Heap that we did from Dave Tobin, in that the DCR does have jurisdiction over this particular area, and they do have the ability to levy fines for non-compliance if we do not file an annual dam report. And the annual dam report is conducted, we've been told has to be conducted by an outside source and can no longer be conducted by the town's engineering division. And the cost of the decommissioning process it is not significantly more than the cost of one of those annual reports. So at minimum, we want to get the Rosemary Dam downgraded. Ideally, we would like to get it taken off the list because we do not believe that it qualifies as a dam.
Jim.
Can we call it a goddamn report? Just joking.
It looks like a dam and smells like a dam.
There is nothing like a dam.
Rick.
Where is the dam, by the way?
It's where the condos are, or right next to the condos, right adjacent to Rosemary across the road. That area was developed, and that's where the dam went all before the Wetlands Protection Act went into effect. So that's the reason why we have a disagreement about whether or not the dam exists with the DCR, because no permits were pulled to take the dam down because there was no requirement for permits to take the dam down at the time.
Is that the Tillotson rubber factory?
Yes.
So we're going to pay $30,000 for something that doesn't exist?
You've just mastered the art of government.
I'm being half facetious, but I think it's quite humorous that we're going to spend 30 grand for something that doesn't exist. Is there any way to make the point that it doesn't exist before we spend the 30 grand?
No, that's the intent of the letter, the guidance that we got from town council, that there is no other process and that they do have the ability to levy fines on the town for not complying.
And the fines for not complying, even though we don't believe we are in compliance, will exceed the $30,000. Or could exceed the $30,000.
Dick.
Madam Chair, I think it makes eminent sense to spend a little more than 1 year's cost of certification in order not to have to continue to pay it. So I move that the Finance Committee recommend approval of the Rosemary Dam commissioning provision.
I second it.
Great. Rick?
Yes.
Barry?
Yes.
Louise?
Yes.
John?
Yes.
Dick?
Yes.
Josh?
Yes.
Tom?
Yes.
Jim?
Yes.
And myself, yes.
Madam Chair, I think the record should show that Kiris will give us all a personal tour of the dam post-COVID-19.
That would be great. Maybe by then it will be decommissioned.
If we can find it.
Karis, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Cecilia, thank you for coming. Okay, going back to the 3 that we skipped over, Property Tax Assistance Program.
Madam Chair, I'm going to have Evelyn Paness join me so we can answer any questions the committee may have about the program. It is, as Evelyn's logging in, it's a $50,000 appropriation from overlay surplus, the same amount as last year. The town has been funding this program for well over a decade now. It was originally established to provide additional funding to match contributions, the voluntary contributions that citizens and businesses can make to the town for property tax relief. And several years ago, in recognition that donations in some parts were declining and not keeping pace, the select board opted to increase the amount beyond just the dollar for dollar match. And then in the last few years, increased the amount of the funding. Just as a reminder, in June for fiscal 21, $50,000 was appropriated, the same amount is being requested now. The prior 2 years to that was an appropriation for $37,000, in the year before that was $25,000. Evelyn actually sits on the board that reviews the applicants for assistance from this program. And if you have any questions about the program, Evelyn can address those.
Rick?
Evelyn, when you and folks came a couple of years ago to request the increase in 50,000, you intended to do the proponents intended to do some advertising to get more people involved and interested in applying. What was the contribution spent out last year?
I'm sorry, the contribution spent down?
How much?
Spent it all. It was distributed. It was distributed to 28 individuals.
Great. Thank you.
Josh?
And yeah, similar to Rick's question, I think we last spoke about this in September of 2020. We received a great table that shows number of applications received, awards. If it's okay, Madam Chair, I could just share my screen briefly to remind everyone.
Yeah.
I can't read that.
I can make that bigger, sorry. Yeah, so this was the amount that was funded, awarded, the average award and the minimum and maximum awards. If we could get the same amount for fiscal year 2021 to compare, that would be great. I think one of the questions in September was that when we increased the amount funded from 25,000 to 37,000, we saw the number of applications and number of awards actually decrease. And I think that at the time that was related to COVID, but it would be really good to see this year's to make sure that that hasn't happened again, because I think the intent of increasing the amount of funding was to increase the base, the size, or the number of people receiving award, not the amount that any individual person was going to receive.
Right. Well, as far as 2020, I believe a lot of the concern or the reason for the decrease in the number of applicants was in effect related to COVID, because the applications are available in February and they're not due back to us until March. So last year we ran into the pandemic, and I think seniors were hesitant to contact us. They didn't have the senior center available. So I think that's why we saw a decrease in the number of applicants. As far as 2021, the committee will be meeting the end of next week. So the applications will be going out shortly thereafter and will be due back beginning of April, end of March, beginning of April. So I won't have the 2021 awards until that point in time.
So I would feel more comfortable just having that data. Last year, we made this appropriation. I think it was planned originally for the annual town meeting, but we ended up making the appropriation in the fall special town meeting. Could we do the same thing? If the appropriations aren't going to go out until April, would it make sense to delay that then?
to know? Go ahead.
Dave?
No, Josh, that the program can't take applications until the actual tax bills have been created. So you'll know the assessments of the properties and the tax burden that the individuals have. And the appropriation that's done at the annual town meeting every year is for the upcoming fiscal year. So, and as you correctly noted, that was one of the items that was deferred in June to October. And what we're talking about is the $50,000. It would be distributed at this time. It has been distributed at this during this time of March, early April, every single year. You'll have the information at the time that you would present the article if you're the member that presents it, but Evelyn wouldn't have the information in the next 8 weeks.
Got it. Thank you.
John?
I move that the Finance Committee recommend adoption of the article appropriating for the Property Tax Assistance Program.
I second it.
Barry?
Sorry, yes.
Louise?
Yes.
Dick?
Yes.
Josh?
Yes.
Tom?
Yes.
Jim?
Yes.
Rick?
Yes.
And John?
Yes.
And myself, yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Evelyn.
Compensated absence fund.
Yes, Madam Chair, this is an appropriation that was deferred last year and not taken. It is an appropriation to cover certain payments that are made to employees, generally long-term employees who are able to sell back at retirement or upon death, and only under those two situations, unused sick time that gets purchased back at 25 cents on the dollar. There are programs that are being phased out over the years, but we still have a healthy number of employees who are eligible for this payment. For small payments, dollar amounts, generally we hope the department operating budget can pay for that, and there would be a vacancy. Those vacant weeks that we're waiting to fill the position would help cover the cost. But payments that represent somebody who has a larger payout, these funds would be available for that. And we would, and we request this year $125,000, and the funding source would be the tax levy.
Questions?
Yeah. Madam Chair, I recommend the adoption of this article at $125,000.
Second that.
Okay, thank you. Barry?
Yes.
Louise?
Yes.
Dick?
Yes.
Josh?
Yes.
Tom?
Yes.
Jim?
Yes.
Rick?
Yes.
John?
Yes.
And myself, yes. Thank you. And then lastly, the town network or internet control. And that is page 7.
Madam Chair, I'm bringing in Roger McDonald. We did cover the topic of this item when we discussed the Finance Department budget. It's a request for $75,000, and we're here to answer any further questions committee members may have.
Good evening, how are you?
Well, thank you.
So questions, Louise?
Just a question on how you came up with the $75,000.
At the time, we spoke with consultants. So we reach out to a couple different consultants that we work with on a regular basis and get an idea of what the applications are that are out there, if there's any need for software, hardware, and what services might be needed for any type of project like this. So that's where we came up with the number.
Josh?
And are any of these expenses expected to recur?
Of the original 75,000, no. There may be, well, there will be some maintenance. What we usually try and do, what I try and do is when we get these new applications that we'll be using, I try to get within that initial dollars anywhere from 2 to 3 years worth of support and maintenance initially, and then so at some point in time, you know, in the next couple of years, I'll be increasing those maintenance dollars to cover what would be there. Typically, off the top of my head, I don't know what the actual value of the software is. It's probably closer to $50,000, $60,000, and the maintenance is usually about 20% of that. So it would be, you know, $12,000, $6,000 or so in that case. So it's usually what it turns out to be.
But even with the software, are there licensing fees that recur?
Those would be, in this case, there aren't any licensing fees. The license, because it's, we're looking at a software as a service. So it's the licensing fees are essentially the annual support and maintenance. In this case, we don't necessarily have named users that log into it. And like we have in other applications where there would be a license per user. It's usually just, in this case, it's, and then several pieces of applications that we have. It's just a one fee that is covers annual support and maintenance for the software.
So after this article, it'll will that be in the operating budget, that fee?
Yes, yeah, it would move into the operating budget, into our line item that covers the annual support and maintenance fees for all the applications we do pay for.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Dick, did you have a question?
Nope.
Any other questions on this?
Madam Chair, I move to recommend adoption of this article at 75,000.
Second. Okay, Barry?
Yes.
Louise?
Yes.
Dick?
Yes.
Josh?
Yes.
Tom?
Yes.
Jim?
Yes.
John?
Yes.
Rick?
Yes.
And myself, yes. Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Aye.
Okay, so finally, returning to the operating budget. We had a few questions still regarding the library. And Louise, did you have any input into that?
Yes. So I did follow up with Anne McFate, the library director. And so what she stated is that they are concerned that the state will have budgetary problems in fiscal year 22, and there may or may not be any state aid payments. So her understanding of why the town manager recommended that certain expenses be placed in the operating budget were based upon that concern over state aid. I asked her what would happen with the state aid money if any or all of the expenses that are currently being covered, including the overdrive plus, and the, I forgot what it's called, the something cat.
World Cat.
The World Cat expense are included in the operating budget. And she stated that basically much of that state aid money would be left over. However, there would still be program expenses of $2,000 to $3,000. The library trustees would like to hire a strategic plan consultant and that totals $5,000 to $7,000, and do a preliminary space study. And the estimate they have for the Collins Center preliminary space study is $12,000. So that all comes up to about $20,000 to $22,000. And then so any leftover funds could then be used to offset costs of building changes or equipment purchases that the studies might recommend. And so she did add a caveat that it is up to the library trustees to make those decisions down the road with whatever state aid funds are left. So that is what I learned.
Okay. Rick?
Louise, is it unreasonable to suggest that we still let the state pay for it? And if at such time that the state decides to reduce their funding, it comes out of the reserve fund?
So if you're asking me, I don't think that it is unreasonable. One thing I will say, and I don't normally get into, personalities and tones of meetings, but the tone of the library trustee meetings was really, I will just say it was not a good tone toward the library trustees, and they seemed to not understand the questions that the finance committee asks, or why the finance committee has a need to ask the types of questions we ask, and why it is that we can't be convinced about library spending and the state aid. So I don't think it's unreasonable, but I think the library trustees strongly disagree with that point of view. And again, I think if you look at those expenses, the overdrive is a recurring expense that libraries are, it's a service libraries are expected to provide. The WorldCat, which is a very small expense of like $3,000 probably as well. The Overdrive Advantage, on the other hand, is one of those, it's really nice to not have to wait for those electronic versions of books, but is that absolutely necessary? I don't know. So I hope I answered that. I think yes, we certainly can let state aid pick up the cost, but if state aid goes away, I think we should anticipate at least $19,000 to be a request in the ordinary operating budget of the library.
And the timing of that going away is when?
Whenever the state lets us know what state aid will look like next year. And I don't have any insight into that, Dave. I don't know if you've seen anything recently.
No. I recall it 2012 that state money was in jeopardy. In 2013, the state money was in jeopardy. In 2014, the state money was in jeopardy. If they really get angry about all of this, but I don't really want to change, at least my position, that if the state is going to pay for it, let the state pay for it until such time that it doesn't exist anymore, then put it in the operating budget, even if it is part and parcel of a piece of library day-to-day business. Mm-hmm. It just raises the amount of money we have to do to make sure the certification is there if we keep doing this. And I'll be still, because I sound like a broken record year after year.
I think we all sound like broken records, but no one knows what a record is anymore.
And they also still have the state aid funds, but they also have the Friends funds as well, right? And
trust funds and all kinds of other places to drive down to get money to run their business, which is fine. But
yeah, that's great. But it seems to me it's those Friends funds that they should utilize for, the funding of a space plan or a strategic plan. So,
yeah.
So does it sound like we want to take the 46,000 out of the town manager's recommended amount? Is that what we're all saying?
I would agree with that. I don't know what we're all saying, but I agree with that.
Yeah, I would agree with it.
Okay.
Is that the, Madam Chair, is that the number, Louise, you were just talking about Advantage Plus, Advantage, whatever the hell it is. But what, is there some amount of money that you thought should be and shouldn't be?
So yes, I think if we were looking at it as those services that are provided by the library that are expected to be provided and should be part of the operating budget, I would include the overdrive, which I think wasn't it just $16,000? I think it was just $16,000. And so fund part of it, but not all of it.
17, actually.
17, sorry. See, I'm losing it in my old age.
And then the World Cat was
$3,000. But the World Cat is such a small amount that I would think they should be able to figure that out, even if state funding goes away.
So what would, I'm sorry, I know Dick wants to speak, but I'm just to finish my thought. So what is the amount that you would say should be in the operating and that which should potentially be paid for by the state aid or whatever?
I guess $17,000 for the overdrive, which is obtaining books electronically.
So you would put that in the operating budget, and the other stuff you would not.
Yes.
Are you sure? I think you mean it the other way around.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I think, Madam Chair, may I?
Overdrive Advantage is nice to have, and you would want that in the state aid.
Correct.
The other 29,000 you would put in the budget.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought Rick's point was not to try to slice the onion here, but take a look at all of these, and if all of them could be covered by the state, they all should be covered by the state. And only if and when the state funds disappear should we look at putting them back in the budget. Otherwise, it's $17,000 we don't need to spend in the budget. And I thought that was what
you're spot on, Dick. That's exactly what I was
agreeing with, and makes sense to me. And then we segued into, should we try to slice the onion?
Right.
Well, I think we sliced the onion for the last six weeks. So, so I would agree. Yeah, it's time. We're going to make a nice burger. But the only thing I would say is that state aid does have a purpose. There is kind of some historical precedence for it. So I guess I would try to do both. So you may call it slice the onion, but I don't think it's inappropriate to do both. And by the way, there's lots of other, friends of this, friends of that. Everyone has a friend. Every one of these departments has money coming in from various sources. Even the spelling bee that we all talk about, that's money that ends up going to the school department. We don't even talk about that. It's a minuscule amount. I get it. The only other thing I wanted to say was this. I wanted to follow up, and however you guys want to do the budget, that's fine. But I do want to follow up with what Louise said. A lot of people are not always happy with the way I present things. Like I'm a little too brusque. I'm a little too loud. And I've heard it for a long, long, long time. But when I saw and heard some of the library meetings, and I heard the way that Anne McFate was treated, that was just not right. That just wasn't right. I think a person like Anne, a person like Evelyn Poness, probably some of the finest public employees that the town has ever had. So that made an impression on me. I want to support Anne. Maybe not as much the trustees, but I want to support Anne. She's been fantastic. So I guess I'm colored a little bit. I'm colored because I think that this is someone that we should be feting. This is someone that we should be congratulating for all she's done for the town for a heck of a number of years. That being said, I'll get off my soapbox and I will go along with whatever the majority wants to do with the budget. And I don't disagree, by the way, with what Rick and Dick has said. As I said previously, I was on, as Rick said, I was on that dance card back in the 1990s. So I get it. But anyway, those are my thoughts.
So
this is not personal for me. I truly admire Anne for a number of ways in terms of Exchange Club and library and all that stuff, and she's very active. But if we split the baby in the bathwater, then next year we'll have the exact conversation, because every year we have the same one. And so, Jim, next year, if we split it this year, we'll have this exact same conversation next year. And all I'm suggesting is that this year we hold and see what happens. I suspect nothing detrimental is going to happen, and life will go on. They'll have the money, they'll run their programs, and we'll see. But if we split it, then we're doing exactly what we did last year and the year before and the year before and the year before that. And so that's kind of all I'm saying here.
Louise.
So I think it might be time to have a real conversation with the library trustees about what they actually see libraries becoming over the next how many ever years. I think libraries are changing, and I think that with COVID, the services have changed significantly, and I'm not sure that going forward, the library model is going to stay the same. So I think it might not be, and I'm not saying like right today, but I think that might not be a bad conversation in general to have with the library trustees, and to maybe see whether that whole entire budget could be looked at and what are the services that are being delivered by that particular institution. And it's all up to them. But, you know, sometimes it's helpful to just ask the question, what do you see? You know, they want to spend $5,000 on a strategic plan or $7,000 on a strategic plan. You know, let's talk in a year. What should the library look like? And otherwise, I think we're kind of stuck. Library looks like what it looks like. The budget looks the same every single year. We're not going anywhere. That's just my own.
No, I don't disagree. I think that's a great idea, because all this will do, if we continue down having the state do it, will make the library trustees more angry and less attentive in terms of working together. I think it's a great idea. I do.
Jeff?
Yeah, I'm very sympathetic to taking a look at where the library should be, but looking at it from a pure financial point of view, we're getting involved in $17,000 we don't need to spend. Yep. Plus there's a ratchet effect to this. So once we spend it, that increases the bar that we have to, the hurdle we have to clear next year. Yep. So I think from a financial point of view, if we have a choice, we should make the choice that minimizes the cost of the town.
Okay. So getting back to that point, what are you recommending that any of this be included in the operating budget, or no. None of it?
The opposite.
The opposite.
The opposite. That everything is paid for by state.
What I'm recommending is that they then spend it out of state funds to buy it, if they think it's an important service, which I'm prepared to assume that it is. But given an alternative means of funding it, it seems to me they should use that alternate source and save the town the 17 plus that would have to be built into next year's budget.
It's not just 17. It's overdrive
well,
advance.
It's whatever the number is, whether it's 46 or 17 46. Or whatever.
And then have a subsequent meeting with the library trustees.
Yeah, I totally think it's appropriate to say team back. And I got the impression that there's been a change in the leadership and the library trustees, and they may be open to a constructive discussion along those lines.
I was going to ask you a question. Philosophically, what is their perspective on the purpose of state aid? Because I do agree. I do have an issue. They've made the determination that this is a necessary operating expense of the library, and Kate has obviously agreed with them because she put it in the budget. And I don't disagree with the nice to haves if that's how we want to determine those things being funded, finding other ways to fund, other creative ways to fund those types of things. But if it really is an integral service that should be provided, my own personal opinion is it should be we should be, if we have the funds, funded through the operating budget. But but it does beg the question: how do they view state aid? I think that's the real crux of the issue. Is our view of it's different and how it should be used than their view. And
so they don't view it as recurring revenue. Every year they look at it as, this year we might not get it. This year we don't know what the exact amount is going to be. It could be 28,000. It could be 34. We just don't know. And so they don't count on it.
But do they spend it, or do they spend it every year?
So we know the answer to that is no.
They stash it away what they don't spend. They don't spend
exactly, because they're allowed to do that.
They end up putting it in the operating account. Yeah.
Right. And then it grows, and then every year we ask them,
what do they do with
your
it?
Plan for spending it?
And they look as if we have, yes.
And they don't spend it because they don't feel like things they want to spend it on, or that they're worried about the rate, saving it for a rainy day. And
no, I think that actually Anne does a really nice job with managing her budget. And so she figures out ways, she can't cover everything, but she figures out ways to cover some of those expenses within the operating budget. And so, her turn back is lower because if she saves a little money here and a little money there, she puts it together and funds one of those expenses out of there.
This comes under the category of someone who's very, very frugal, and we're spending a lot of time on her.
Yeah.
And yet there's a lot of departments that spend millions, and we spend no time on that. But I know that I'm digressing. I don't disagree.
That's a fair point.
I don't disagree with what Rick and Dick have said. I'm familiar with this debate. As I said, that was my first department in 1993. My first department was library. So I'm familiar with the whole thing. But go ahead, Louise. Go ahead.
No, we have the same discussion every single year regarding the library. And I'd like to be able to somehow jumpstart it and change the discussion maybe. And I think it has to do more with the strategic plan for the library. And that's their word, than it does with what the actual expenditures are.
Okay, with that being said, if they came to us and said, we would like to fund a strategic plan or do a space plan next year and put that, what would we say to that?
Out of state aid.
Right.
Yeah. Spend all state aid till there's nothing left, and then when there's nothing left, knock on our door. Right?
Yep.
Right?
Go ahead and do it. Right. Go ahead and do it.
I know this sounds awful, but
it only sounds awful because really one of that part of the things they're asking for are annual appropriations now, and they should be in the operating budget.
But see, that's my very point. I'm not suggesting that those things don't rise to the level of the day-to-day operation. All I'm saying is, since the state is willing to pay for it, let the state pay for it until such time that the state no longer pays for it and then put it in the operating budget or put it someplace else. That's the only point I'm making. I'm not suggesting at all telling them how to run their business or what is important. All I'm suggesting is if the state is willing to pay for it, let the state pay for it.
Or use the state money in some useful way. I guess if the state really knew they were sitting there hoarding this money,
yeah,
they probably wouldn't be awarded it on an annual basis.
Yeah,
you're wrong about that. You're wrong. The whole program, in my opinion, was intended to give the libraries additional flexibility. That was the whole program, beyond what a municipality would pay. That was the whole program. That
it should be used for these other nice to haves, I guess.
And I think you're right, Barry. I think you're right.
Right, but we're suggesting that's the conundrum, because we're suggesting that they use it for the must-have.
Correct. And I think the must-have should be in the budget. That's my opinion.
And then the debate is what's a must-have versus one. Yeah. But I think everyone has said, let's have a meeting with them. Let's try and understand what their thought process is. I think that's a good idea. And for now, it seems to me the consensus is that we'd rather not include it in the operating, and then we can deal with the issue as we move forward.
Okay.
Madam Chair, would you like a motion?
I don't think we need to necessarily vote on it, do we? No, we don't need to vote on it. I just want to get a confirmation that we are taking 46,000 out of the town manager's recommended budget. Does that seem right to you, Louise?
Yes.
Right? Everybody?
You're muted, Louise.
I'm sorry. I said that is what is being proposed. I'm still in the very point of view. I mean, I still think the 26,000 that is the, recurring
should be
included in the operating budget. But I think the most other finance committee members feel otherwise, that's fine. That's the consensus of the committee.
All right, so let's take 46,000 out of the town manager's recommended budget. And then, Louise, do you want to follow up though with the library trustees and see if we could have them in for a meeting?
Yes, I will do that.
Can I step in on this? In all due respect and great intentions, I mean, we have a lot to do over the next 2 months on other items. There's the rest of the warrant we have to go through. And I just don't know if it's, we would have the time. I'd be happy to say, let's do it for next fall while we're starting our whole process, but I'm not quite sure what purpose it's going to serve between now and May town meeting.
Yeah, I agree with that.
It's fine.
Yeah. I'll just get back to them, let them know our thought process, and that we'll talk to them next fall.
Thank you.
Okay. So then, Louise.
So we will need to vote the budget and also decide the items that you've pulled out. Do you want to house them somewhere else in this budget or just decrease the bottom line? So that would be the public information officer, the police clinical expense, and this library money. The library expenses of 49,000.
So we would, Dick?
Madam Chair, I suggest we reserve it in the reserve fund for now in case some persuasive argument is made to us in the next week or 10 days.
Yeah, I agree with that. Anybody else?
I think it's our budget.
Yep.
So I think that whatever the finance committee decides to do, that's what we should do.
This is a preliminary budget though, Jim.
Pardon me?
Final budget is going to be voted on in a couple of weeks.
Right,
Yeah.
but it's our budget.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, so I've been hearing a lot of discussion about, well, let's move money out of the town manager. The town manager doesn't have a budget. Town manager has a recommendation.
It's the framework within which we're working, though. It's easy, an easy reference.
So you and I are still there. We're still out here. But Dick, it's our budget. We could change every line item if we wanted.
I agree.
Okay.
All we're doing is a shorthand, Jim, referring to lines.
Right.
Okay. Well, yeah. I think it's
fine.
I think it's all definitional.
All right.
Madam
So
Chair.
we're gonna, Josh. Yes.
Oh, I think Dick's right. You know, things could change between now and the final budget. So it might not be important right now, but ultimately, I think I would prefer to take it out of the bottom line of the budget because the tax rate, for instance, is based upon that budget. And if we put it in the reserve fund, then that just increases taxes for all residents.
I was only suggesting we park it there for 2 weeks, not that we leave it there permanently.
Yeah. So I'm just saying, in the end, if we don't find another house for them between now and the next month, I think we would take them out of the bottom line.
Might there also be any other priorities that we believe are important that may have been brought forth by the departments that perhaps weren't advanced, but we think they should be advanced? Have we considered that?
You bring up a good point, Jim.
Well, in the old days, we brought it up all the time. And I'm not, I don't.
We have in the past, yeah. We've in fact approved positions that weren't in the town managers. So I totally agree that is within our purview and our responsibility. I'm just not aware of them right now.
All right, so for now though, we're going to reduce the operating budget and then park those funds in the reserve fund temporarily.
Yeah, I think your framework, we're reducing it from the departmental and we're putting it in the townwide, but it's still in the operating budget.
Right.
Josh. So I guess in 2 weeks, that'll be the next meeting before the budget is due. So will we be voting on this budget again at that point?
Yes.
So Carol, are you requesting a motion right now from us?
No.
Okay.
Right? Well, do we have to vote the draft? Yes. So yes. I need a motion to vote the draft budget.
Let me try my hand at it, if I may, John.
Go ahead.
That, Jim, if you'll excuse me on this, that we take the recommended proposed budget as submitted by the town manager, adjusting it as follows. Eliminating the 98,163 in the PIO position, eliminating the $45,000 in the police department's budget for the clinical support position, and the $46,000 in the library budget, increasing the reserve fund by those three amounts, and approving as adjusted the bottom line of 195, 989, 980.
I second that.
Thank you. Rick?
Yes.
Barry?
Yes.
Louise?
Yes.
Josh?
Yes.
Dick?
Yes.
John?
Yes.
Tom?
Yes.
Jim?
Yes.
Great. Thank you. So, so we're not meeting next week, and then we'll meet again on the 3rd of March.
One quick question. Are we Are we recommending that the 98,000 for the PIO and the 45,000 for the clinical support be warrant articles? Is that?
Yes.
Okay.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
Okay. Rick?
Yes.
Barry?
Yes.
Louise?
Yes.
John?
Yes.
Dick?
Yes.
Josh?
Yes.
Tom?
Yes.
Jim?
Yes.
Rick, you made the motion, and myself. We are adjourned.